Knowledge alone destroys ignorance, just as light removes darkness. Knowledge does not create the self, which is always present, but simply removes the ignorance covering it. Due to ignorance, the self appears as if it's limited by the body and mind. But once ignorance is removed, the infinite Atman is revealed, just as hidden treasure is uncovered when the earth is removed. The self is covered by ignorance, just as the sun is hidden by clouds. When ignorance is destroyed, the self shines forth in its true nature. The world is like a dream, appearing real while it lasts, but disappearing upon awakening. Similarly, this material world seems real until one attains self-knowledge. Just as a rope appears as a snake in darkness due to ignorance, we mistake the non-self, the body and mind, for the true self, Atman. But when true knowledge arises, the illusion disappears. The Atman, the true self, is without birth, death, or change. It is pure consciousness, beyond the body, mind, and senses. Just as a mirror covered with dust does not reflect clearly, the self is not recognized due to the impurities of the mind. The wise person who removes the impurities of the mind through knowledge sees the self clearly, just as a clean mirror reflects an image perfectly. Just as a fire burns wood to ashes, knowledge burns away ignorance and reveals the eternal self. The self is all-pervading like space. It does not move or change. It is pure consciousness, infinite and beyond suffering. The self is not affected by pleasure or pain, just as the sun is unaffected by the activities of the world. Just as the sun shines on all things, but is not affected by them, so the self remains detached from the body and mind. The true self is beyond birth and death. It is eternal, pure, and untouched by worldly experiences. The wise person realizes that the self is different from the body, mind, and senses, just as one separates milk from water. A wise person renounces attachment to the world, just as a snake sheds its old skin, realizing that they are the eternal self. Through self-knowledge, the wise one sees that Atman, the Self, is infinite and indivisible, like an ocean without waves. Even when living in a body, the liberated person remains untouched by its limitations, just as the sky is not affected by clouds. The wise one realizes, I am Brahman, beyond body, mind, and senses. I am infinite consciousness, untouched by pleasure and pain. The Self is beyond gross, subtle, and causal bodies. It is pure awareness like space, all-pervading and infinite. Even when the body perishes, the Self remains, just as space remains unaffected, even when a pot is broken. The Self is eternal and ever present. It does not need to be attained, only recognized by removing ignorance. When ignorance disappears, the true Self realizes it was never different from Brahman, like a wave realizing it is the ocean. A person attached to the body identifies as I and mine, but the knower of truth sees the Self as limitless consciousness. The Self is blissful and ever free. Only ignorance creates bondage. One should meditate on the Self, realizing, I am Brahman, just as a pot made of clay is nothing but clay. The wise one, realizing their true nature, becomes free from fear and sorrow. The ignorant suffer due to attachment to the body, but the wise remain established in self-knowledge. A liberated soul is free from desire, just as a fully bloomed lotus is untouched by water. As long as ignorance remains, suffering exists. When self-knowledge dawns, suffering disappears. Through self-knowledge, one attains peace, bliss, and freedom from the cycle of birth and death. Just as water poured into water becomes one, the knower of Brahman merges into Brahman. Thus the wise person lives in the bliss of the Self, free from illusion and suffering. Just as space remains unaffected by the objects within it, the Self remains unaffected by the body, mind, and senses. The Self is a silent witness to all actions of the body and mind. It does not act, but simply observes. The Self is infinite, beyond all modifications. Just as the sun remains unchanged even when clouds pass before it. Due to ignorance, people think of themselves as the doer of action, but when knowledge dawns, they realize they are pure consciousness, beyond action. Just as a lamp illuminates a room, but remains unaffected by what happens inside, so the self illuminates the body and mind, but remains untouched by their activities. The ignorant person identifies with the body and mind, just as a traveller mistakes the motion of a boat for his own movement. When the false identification with the body and mind disappears, one realizes that they are pure consciousness, beyond birth and death. The ignorant feel bound by pleasure and pain, but the wise remain detached, just as a lotus remains untouched by water. Just as gold remains gold, whether it is shaped into a bracelet, ring, or necklace, the self remains unchanged, though appearing as different bodies and minds. One who realizes the self transcends duality and attains eternal peace. The wise see all beings as one with the self. Just as pots may hold different amounts of water, but all water is one. Just as one fire burns in different pieces of wood, the self shines equally in all beings, though appearing as many. A person who attains self-knowledge sees no difference between Brahman and the individual self, just as waves are nothing but the ocean. The ignorant see themselves as separate from Brahman, but the wise realize that all is Brahman. The self is beyond form and formlessness, beyond name and attributes. It is pure awareness. Just as a river loses its name and form upon merging into the ocean, the knower of the self becomes one with Brahman and is freed from illusion. The wise see no difference between themselves and others. They remain free from desires and attachments, experiencing only bliss. The self is not affected by virtue or sin, just as the sun is not affected by the impurities of the world. One who meditates on the self constantly becomes free from fear, sorrow, and suffering. Just as a person, once awakened, never mistakes a dream for reality, so the knower of the self never falls back into ignorance. The self is beyond past, present, and future. It is changeless, infinite, and eternal. A person who knows the self attains permanent peace. Just as a river, after reaching the ocean, never returns. just as a dry leaf is carried away by the wind. The ignorant are carried away by desires, but the wise remain steady like a mountain. The wise one, established in self-knowledge, is free from the cycle of birth and death. The liberated being is not attached to honor or dishonor, pleasure or pain. They remain in calm equanimity. Just as space is not affected by what happens within it, so the self remains untouched by bodily experiences. A person who knows the self is like a flame unaffected by the wind, always steady, unmoved by worldly fluctuations. One should meditate constantly on the truth, I am Brahman, until all doubts disappear. When ignorance is destroyed, the individual self realizes it was always Brahman, just as water poured into the ocean becomes one with the ocean. A person who realizes the self attains supreme bliss beyond all suffering. For one who has attained self-realization, there is no more birth, no more karma, no more bondage, only eternal peace. The self is beyond good and evil, beyond all opposites. It is pure awareness, infinite and eternal. The wise no longer identify with the ego, but remain established in Brahman, experiencing only oneness. When one realizes the self as Brahman, they attain the ultimate goal, moksha, eternal peace, and blissful liberation.